Thank you.
Resumed. Okay, here we go. Well, welcome recording to Tips and Tricks. So first off, why should we use the gradebook? Why are we suggesting that you use the gradebook? So it's going to be a record of all of the grades and all of your feedback for all the different activities in one place. If you don't use Gradebook, then people have to go into all of the individual tools to find their grades and their feedback for those tools. And so actually this just brings it all into one centralized spot. So it's always accessible and means that the students and learners always have their feedback accessible. If you've ever given a student a piece of paper with some feedback on and asked for it back a month later, please let me know how many of you would get that bit of paper back. If I had asked my students to do that, I think I would have got like 1 out of a class of 20. Number 2, Gradebook can do all of your calculations for you. This is not only good for you, so you have a proper idea as a facilitator or a teacher about where your students are and how well they're doing, but it's also really useful for them. It means that you're being transparent about how well they're doing so that they can be kind of alerted if they aren't doing so well. Like imagine if I have got, 2 slightly disappointing results back for some labs, and I just go, oh, do you know what? I've done really well in everything else. It's just those 2 labs. But those 2 labs are weighted, 50% of my course. That means that I think I'm really on track. And so I'm not reaching out to my teachers to say I need help. Whereas actually, if I'd been able to see that, I hadn't got a great mark and those were kind of pretty heavily weighted, then at least I have the opportunity to kind of correct that and ask for help. They're also easily exportable. Do you need to put your grades into another system? You might well need to. And so as long as you're doing all of your feedback and your grading in Brightspace anyway, that means that you can just press one button and that can export out into a spreadsheet so that you don't have to type everything in, because that is laborious and long, and we don't want you doing that one. You have better things to spend your time doing. You can also use grade items to trigger other activities. So one of my favorite things to do with grade items is if someone hasn't done so well, so if they got 40% in a quiz, then I can make sure some content on that item gets automatically released to them to help them kind of re-engage, revisit it, maybe re-explain the same topic in a different way so that they can maybe reattempt it, but it just gives them that remedial pathway. But also, especially right now when everyone's online, actually it's really nice to send a well done, just saying, look, I noticed that you're doing really, really well. Congratulations on the quiz score, that looks great. Without me needing to, I can set those up in advance and we can trigger them based off your grade items. Quite often people will ask at this point, so why on earth should I be using grades instead of the class progress tool? So some customers do use the gradebook only for summative assessments, the ones that contribute to your final grade. And so they keep the rest of your kind of like the formative assessments, the homework items, etc. They'll keep them just in the tools. They won't attach a grade item so that they don't kind of confuse people or make it look like you've got to complete 50 different activities that contribute to your final grade. But also class progress has a ton of other detail in it, right? It has your grades, your quizzes, your content progress. It's just a much more holistic overview. And so the grades tool just becomes a little bit more of a pared down version of that. Right, so let's just make sure we're on the same page about a little bit of terminology. So we've actually got 3 different types of gradebook. And gradebook is the name that we give to kind of like that overall system, the governing system of the individual grade items, those individual grades. And so I'm going to start with weighted. So your weighted system is essentially where you apply percentage weightings or importance to various different items. So if you look at the kind of image of my gradebook on the left-hand side, you can see the last column, which with the red has all the weightings. So that all of those kind of indented week 1 quizzes are within the quiz area. And those quizzes are worth 60 in total. And each of the weekly quizzes is worth 10 of that 60. So another example even, your course is broken down into a final exam, which is worth 60% of your final grade. And then you've got essays, which are worth 40% of your final grade. So, but out of those essays, you actually have 2 different ones. So I've got one which is worth 75% and one which is a much smaller essay. It's really just a paragraph. And so it's only worth 25% of that 60. And so altogether, that makes my 100% final grade. And that's kind of why you do use the weighted gradebook. If you've got percentages or you're assigning importance on things, that one's mostly kind of percentage based. If you want to exclude things from final grade but keep them in the category, so maybe I have a week 7 quiz but it doesn't contribute to final grade just because it's a revision week, I can just give it a weighting of 0, but still put it in that category. We've got our second type of gradebook, which is points. So points is pretty much the same as weighted, it's just without percentages. So I've got my category, it's called Dr. Know Your Rubrics, and within that I've got 4 different activities. I can't count today. Maximum points for each of them are 100, which makes the category point of 400. I could change that category point if I wanted as well. So I could have a category is worth 20, but it's everything's marked out of 20 as well. Also, just using the categories, really, really nice way to organize your grades themselves. Just going to check a little bit in on some of the questions and answers.
Yep, we've got one here that you might know the answer to around, is there value to using the gradebook when we are using a pass-fail system?
Yes, 100% actually. So that is partly to do with so in terms of using pass or fail, that's largely going to be to do with the type of grade item, which is what we're going to get onto next. So if we can just pause that thought for 1 second, I will explain to you how you can use it. But also, even if you're using a pass or fail system, remember that Gradebook is there to give you oversight into how you're doing at each of those different activities. So if you have more than one activity, even if they are all done pass fail, really, really valuable to still have it there so people understand what's contributing to their kind of like final pass or final fail. Hopefully not that one.
We've got another question here, Sophie, around, is it possible to do grading for groups in the Gradebook?
Yes, you can actually filter your gradebook by group when you want to, and you can filter your grade items by group as well. I will actually show you that in a bit. Let's see, combination of both grading schemes. Yep. Okay. All right. Do you know what? Let's go on to grade items, and then I'm going to revisit these questions and answers because I feel like that might help. Okay. So grade items and schemes. So we have a number of different grade items. You can only attach numeric and select box grade items to activities. So to like an assignment or a discussion, you can attach both numeric and select box grade items. To quizzes, you can only attach numeric grade items just because quizzes are inherently numeric. Just because you've got like a true or a false. And so they are inherently numeric. This is actually not a limitation, right? You can use what we call grade schemes to represent those grades in a different way. So if I've got maybe 8 out of 10 is actually going to be a grade B, then I can use a grade scheme to say, okay, and 80% to 85% is going to be represented with the letter B. And you can actually control the visibility of all of those different items. So I could show 8 out of 10 plus B, or I could only show B, or I could show just 80% B. You've got a couple of different options that you can configure within the grade item themselves. You can also actually do this not just on individual grade items. You can do this across your whole grade book. So perhaps if I wanted to use a pass or fail system, I would actually use, depending on if you ever need the numbers behind them, which you might, but you may not. If I had a pass or fail, what I'd do is I'd create a select box grade item type, and you need to define what that pass and fail is using a grade scheme. And I can actually set that on my whole grade book so that by default, everything is going to be using that kind of pass or fail. I can change it for individual items. So if I wanted to change the word pass to overall pass, for example, then I could do that as well by using a different grade scheme. But I will give you a little bit of insight into kind of the logic of the other ones. So we do have a pass or fail grades item here, but they don't attach to activities. And so all you'd need to do is create a select box grade item and then add a grade scheme to it. Automatically, you have to do that by default to create the actual words that you use within select box. It's just going to give you like a drop-down menu. And you'd write pass or fail, and that means that you can attach that to any of your activities. It also means that you can apply that same pass or fail grade scheme to the numeric grade items that you attach to quizzes. We do have some other types. I'm going to just cover text first. Text is largely if you're just going to put in some comments into the gradebook. That's really what it means. It means it's a comment box. And so it means that you can type in whatever you like. And that might be typing in some information about attendance or maybe behavioral aspects, or perhaps if someone has any kind of special educational needs that you wanted to flag in there so that you remember them and you consider them when grading. That's a really good use for text. The reason that we're not saying that you can attach formula and calculated grade items is because those are grade items that are like a bunch of other ones. So a calculated grade item is basically going to add up a ton of different numeric ones. So I could add up my weekly quizzes from weeks 1 to 6 in a calculated grade item. For formula, that's just providing conditions. So if someone has got over 50%, then I'm going to give them in 5 grade items, then I will give them a grade of 100, which is pass. Okay. I'm just going to take you into my site. It's a demo site, so it does look a little bit different, just to show you a couple of the different settings and also just to add a little bit of context to what I'm saying. So I'm hoping that you can see my screen and a lovely history of art course. Good. So we're going to land on the manage grades page, and that's just because I prefer to land here. And this is going to give me a list of all of my different grade items that I've got in the system. You've then got the ability to create new, and this is where you create new items or categories. And the categories are the ones that you can kind of control percentages with. And I can also go into the enter grades page, which is literally where you enter grades. And I've got either this kind of overview, or I can go to spreadsheet view where I can actually enter those grades myself. Schemes is where you create schemes, but the kind of secret settings that I wanted to take you to is this little small gear wheel, which you can always see whenever you're in the gradebook. This is going to take you to all of the different display options. And I saw someone asking a question about, can you retroactively change your gradebook? Yeah, you can. If you go into calculation options, it's going to say, oh, what is your system, your grading system? So I've got my weighted one, my points, or formula if you wanted to do it that way. This is also then when I can decide on my final grade release. Really important factors. Calculated final grade means that the system is going to define it and add everything up and give them a calculated final grade, and I can't change it. Adjusted final grade, which is my preferred one, means that I can actually edit it. So it involves your professional opinion. So if someone is like 1 mark off getting a slightly different grade band and they've put in loads of work, you can adjust their final grade to reflect that. You can choose to automatically or not automatically release final grade. Usually I'd say maybe don't. Just gives you a little bit more professional control. And then you've got grade calculations. So this is all to do with if people do or do not do activities. So drop ungraded items means that if there is no grade, and that could also be like no attempt as well from a student at any activity, then actually we're not even going to calculate that activity's points into the final grade. So say the activity was worth 100 points, I'm actually taking that out of my overall activity calculation. So instead of getting 400 out of 500, they're actually going to get 400 out of 400 now. Treat ungraded items as 0 is the opposite. So it means that if they have not got a grade, then we're putting a 0 in there. So if they have not attempted it or it hasn't been graded, then they're going to get a 0 on that activity. You can change those pretty easily. Don't save those ones for now. And then you've got your org unit display options, which is where you can configure your student view. So how your students kind of see the grades tool. You can configure this on individual items as well. But on general gradebook, I can say, do I want the students to see the points grade? The grade scheme symbol, so that's my pass or my fail or my A or my C, and the grade scheme color. I might not want to show them that. Usually I just use that to color code my own gradebook so I can see if there's someone who's just trending red. And you can also display how the final grade was calculated to users, which is quite a useful thing and might reduce the amount of questions that you get after people get their final grades. Last bit is personal display options, and these are just for you, right? You're the facilitator. You can change how you see everything. So I can say I want to see all the user details in my gradebook. I also want to see the points grade and the symbol and the color. I don't just want to see I just don't just want to see the kind of the symbol. And then I can change my start page. This is my favorite one. I prefer to start on manage grades, but if you're always having to click into enter grades, then make sure you start on that page. It's right there for you to configure. Okay. I'm going to pop back into my presentation. Good. Going to move on to use cases now, just because we're halfway through. And I wanted to talk about how you would achieve various use cases within the gradebook. So this situation is I only want the top 4 out of 5 grades to count. So this might be I've got 5 labs, and actually I want to take the 4 top highest marks out of that, or I want to drop the lowest one. You need to create a new category, and then you want to configure how you can distribute those points around that category. And so this is an image of the kind of when you go through to create a category, this is what you get. Within the weighted gradebook, it's going to say, do you want to manually assign weight to the items in the category, or do you want to distribute the weights evenly? But also, how many highest or lowest items do I want to drop? So I would say 1. I'm going to, out of my category of 5, I'm going to drop 1. So I'd fill in a kind of 1 in this area here. And it's the same kind of rule for points gradebook as well. Am I going to just distribute points evenly or not? And then how many items do I want to drop? Once you've configured your category, you can go ahead and create your grade items. And while you're creating grade items, you just add them into the category, and it will do those kind of calculations for you and apply the logic that you have decided on. Number 2, complex calculations. This is where we get to dive into calculated versus formula grade items a little bit more. So when would you use which one? Calculated is literally just adding up. So in the example, as you can see there, calculating a midterm or some sort of subtotal, a semester total, or a topic or unit total of grades. So I'm just saying I'm going to add up quiz 1 and quiz 2, quiz 3, quiz 4, and that will add up to be a nice percentage. And that's calculated. Formula grade items, much more complex to build, but they do allow you to set conditions around the grade item to determine your final grade. So as an example, if you wanted to make sure that people received at least 50% on their midterm and a final exam to pass their course, then you'd use the kind of formula there. Or you can give at least 50% on all participation grade items to achieve a perfect attendance bonus. If you do need to set conditions around your grade items like this to kind of add into one specific final grade, I'd highly advise posting in the community just so that we can kind of dive into those questions there and point you towards some resources. Just because quite a few people have actually online shared their formulas, so someone might have done it for you. Bonus grades. So we have the concept of bonus grades and also exceeding. So the can exceed option is if you want to allow someone's grades to exceed the maximum number of points. So if I'm grading out of 50 and I actually want to give them, 52, then I can do that. Just as an FYI, you have to have the can exceed to allow bonus points pretty much. Because otherwise, if you're adding bonus points and someone got 50 out of 50 and you haven't clicked exceed, then they're not going to get those bonus points. So make sure that you're clicking the can exceed so that you're not capping out. You don't have to, of course, but it does mean that anyone who has got full marks can't achieve those bonus points. These are also just within the grade when you set them up yourself. Floating grade items. You might have heard us talk about this a little bit before, but essentially a floating grade item is a grade item that is not attached to an activity. Why on earth would you have that? So this used to be to actually reflect activities done outside of Brightspace, so like a presentation or an activity, a demonstration of skills. But since we created the in-person assignment type to kind of reflect this, it's actually not as common. But so nowadays people use these to indicate either attendance. So they might have a category called attendance and create grade items unattached to anything to mark attendance. Alternatively, if to just add in that extra information about a student, a bit like that text box example that I gave you. You wouldn't need to attach that grade item to anything for that to happen. If you are, using floating grade items, or actually any grade items, frankly, but more so for attendance or for that kind of extra information about the student, you can exempt people from all of these as well. So if someone has said, I'm not going to be there and it's, for a perfectly legitimate reason, then you can exempt people from the grades. So from within your gradebook, you simply press the downward arrow next to any grade item and press enter grades, and then you'll hit this kind of nice area at the bottom there. And I could click on Georgia Bond, the little square next to her name, and then just press that exempt button, and that will exempt her from needing to actually complete that grade item. Okay, I know we've got quite a few questions coming up as well. Before I get to finishing touches, then I might just see if we can ping through a couple of the questions here.
Yeah, I think related to the last thing you were mentioning there, Sophie, around bonus points, what's sort of the inverse of that? If you actually wanted to apply a point penalty for assignments or activities that were submitted late, is there a way to do that inside the gradebook?
Oh, no, there's not. But you'd be able to see, so when you're grading any kind of like assignment or a quiz, it will flag up as late when you're grading it, right? So you'd be able to see if people had done it late and you could apply a penalty there if you wanted to. Alternatively, that's a really good use case for those kind of text box items of being able to say, X assignment or grade was late, we'll need to penalize, either later. Some people like to apply those, that kind of deduction at the end of the course as opposed to during.
Okay, what else? We've got a question here around making sure that the students can see all of the gradebook columns that are text. I'm not sure I quite understand that one. Does that make sense to you?
No, not massively.
I think there's another one here that's similar about how, what do students see if you use text as the grade option?
Right, yeah. They will see the text. So you can actually hide the grade items. If you're using them as a private text box, then I'd highly advise hiding them. Just a quick note, if you do hide a grade item, if it's attached to an activity and you publish that, that feedback, then they'll be able to see that information in class progress. So if you are intending for it to be entirely secret from students, especially for the text situation, then just when you're creating your grade item, there's a tab called restrictions, and you just need to press hide.
And then on that similar note, there's some questions around showing an incomplete. If you wanted the student to realize they had an incomplete on an assignment or for the entire course, how could you enter that in the gradebook?
Sure. So you wouldn't necessarily have to enter anything, right? So when a student sees their gradebook, essentially what they see is they see a list of grade items, and then they see the kind of score and feedback links. That's what they see. So if they have not done something, then they will not see a score. They'll see like a kind of dash of a line, and they won't see a feedback link. So that will be pretty obvious. It will also show as kind of the outstanding assignment, etc. What you can always do especially to remind students to do that, is you can use the kind of email people without submissions from the assignment folders or the assignment tools, or you could use intelligent agents to message people who had not done any of, and then just fill in some of the details there. So had not submitted to this, an assignment, have not completed XYZ quiz. And that would send them an email saying, there's something incomplete without you having to manually check every single student.
Okay, there's another one here, probably a good tip to answer here. The Helen is asking, the students can't see their gradebook if the I icon is not next to their name. What is the easiest way to open up that icon, open up the visibility?
They can't see it if there's an I icon next to their name.
The little, whether you've turned something on to make it visible to everyone or not.
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay. So that's just in the restrictions area of the grade item setup. So as long as the grade item is not hidden, then they can see it. But they won't see the score unless the actual score is published, right? So it's not like you fill it in and then they can see it. If you, for example, got everyone to submit to an assignment and you've graded and you pressed save as draft, the learner can't see it. They can see in the gradebook that they won't have a grade next to that grade item, but they won't be able to see the grade unless you click the word publish. If the grade item does have an I with like a cross through it next to it, it means that you've hidden the grade item and you just need to unclick that hide button to make them see it.
Excellent. There's another question here asking about why do I sometimes get grade items listed twice in the grade book?
If you've created them twice or if you copied them in, that might be the case. Actually, this slide here might help just as we walk through. But so just as a part of finishing touches, what I'd highly advise doing is checking out your gradebook, that manage grades page, like the picture at the top, and making sure that all of your grade items have associations unless they are floating grade items and you intend them to be that way. And so if you see the one with the red box, Unit 5 assignment, it's got no association. That means that it's that grade item is not attached to an activity. So if I grade Unit 5 assignment in the assignments tool, that grade is not going to flow through into Gradebook because I have not created that association. So it's a kind of good thing to check. But it's also what you want to do if you have got like multiple of the same grade item is to figure out what it's attached to. And if there's one that is just there but not associated with anything, then you can delete that one because students won't be able to complete that item anyway because it's a grade item and the grade items are only in your control. They can't, submit to a grade item. They can submit to an assignment, they can complete an activity, but they can't actually do anything with a grade item. The other finishing touch that I was going to suggest is do check out your statistics. We have statistics buried all over Brightspace for every single tool. My favorite one is content statistics, but grade statistics come pretty soon after. If you press the downward arrow next to any grade item, like just here, then you'll see a grade statistics and it'll take you through to this area on the left-hand side, which will show you your grade distribution across your class, like how many, the minimum, the maximum, the average, and you can use that view by user filter to filter down to group, or you can go through users as well specifically to see what everyone's got.
On that note of class progress, Sophie, we've got an interesting question around, is there a recommendation for using class progress instead of the gradebook if the course is really focused around completion and not necessarily the level of the grade or the competency that's achieved? Is there a case when you wouldn't bother with a gradebook?
I'd still bother with the gradebook mostly for your own purposes, right? From a facilitator's perspective, it means that everyone's going to kind of, you can see everything in one place. For the students, though, it's much more about directing them to things, right? Giving them the option. You can create drop-down menus within your kind of nav bar to say, like, Matt, watch your progress. You've got to complete everything. But, they can, if it is just complete and there's no kind of pass mark anywhere, then, definitely just use the class progress. But you need to, I feel like grades is still going to be needed anyway. You're still going to need to mark something. And also just be able to keep track of those marks. And if you did want to export your pass and your fails at each of those activities, then that's the way to do it, is through the gradebook.
And then we've got another one just before we're ending up here. We've got another one that you might be able to tell us, Sophie. Lori's asking, is there a negative impact if you just rerun through the whole grade wizard setup versus going directly to the settings like you showed us?
No, you can actually go straight through the wizard as well. It's exactly the same. Mine's just a shortcut to doing that if you already know what you need to do, but you can 100% go through the setup wizard. It's very useful, and there are lots of little eye icons everywhere, like little question marks that will give you information on like what everything means. I know that there are other questions. I just wanted to flick to this very last one for finishing touches. Your export options are really granular, so don't type into a spreadsheet if you don't have to, right? So you can export by points grade, by last name, first name, grade item, all specific things. And then you can use a ton of different release conditions with your grades. That's kind of the value of using the grades tool over anything else, is that it can get really granular. So I can say if they've got a specific score in a rubric or a no grade received or a grade value on a grade item, and that grade value could very well be pass or fail, then I can control the release of material and content and activities and remedial information, all from that grade item, which is kind of why we really suggest using them, because they're very powerful things. Other than that, this session was recorded, and we will we'll export all of your questions that are currently waiting for answers, and we will share them in the community along with the recording to this session within this PowerPoint as well. Just wanted to draw your attention to the customer success events page in the community. Please do follow it to get updates. We have more tips and tricks and more admin sessions as well for your administrators. And that's where we share the recordings. And also we've got a whole load of resources here as well to point you towards as well. But yeah, thank you so much. And I'm just going to see if we've got, is there any other question you think that we should answer specifically, Amy?
No, I think we'll have to dig into some of these, and we'll write up a nice article for everyone summarizing all of the questions that were asked today, and along with the answers for future reference. Fantastic, great. Thank you so much, guys. Absolute pleasure having you here. And look to that community space where we'll be posting the answers to your questions. And there will be an email sent out following the session with the links to the recording and the links to any additional resources, as well as that question and answer article. So stay tuned for that. That should be coming in the next day or so.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Good job, Sophie.